And we will begin. We will begin. Hold on one second. Start again. Okay. Okay, once I'm having some trouble with the screen share, let me be sure. There we go. Now we have it. Now we have the screen share. Okay, now we'll begin. Hmm. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, y'all.
Give family, ancestors no leave me. Naya Bingi, Bobo Shanti. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, ay, oh, oh, oh. Ay, 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 ay. Hey, hey. Ay, 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 ay. Oh, oh. Ay, ay, ay. Hey, hey, listen, the blood of African kings run in my vein. Here in a Jamaica, rebellious offspring. We've got a warrior spirit inside. From that time we can't change. And this a warrior spirit inside. It come for break every shackle and chain. Man a Shaka Zulu, Whitney and Kuma, Whitney, Kunta Kinte, Whitney. Looks like Malcolm and Martin and Marcus and Fiery, Kuma, Whitney, Vela Kute, Whitney, Kunta Kinte, Whitney. It's like Yavi and Marley and Fiery. Look how many years them whip with. That's when they whip power microchip with. And I got the Babylon style of fit me. Buckle it out, come make we get to with victory. Them fight my brother and sister. And when we are dance, them say we're moving sinister. When all we do is love our culture. I beat the drums and we are chase the vultures away. Mana Shaka Zulu, Whitney, Paul Bogle, Whitney, Lulumba, Whitney. It's like Martin and Malcolm and Marcus and Fiery, Yavi, Whitney, King Selassie, Whitney, Mandela, Whitney. It's like Marcus and Martin and Fiery. The thoughts of freedom fighters dwell in my brain. Stolen from Africa, the mission is still the same. We've got a warrior spirit inside. It's well wild, it can't tame. And this a warrior spirit inside. It come for break every shackle and chain. And them a try brainwash we. Guys we mind the meditation dirty. They never tell we say black is beauty. Me nah go bleach, me say me nah dilute it. No, hey you search your history. Break the puzzle, come make we solve the mystery. Hey, a Solomonic dynasty from the line of David, what a priceless legacy. Mana Shaka Zulu, Whitney, and Kuma, Whitney, Kunta Kinte, Whitney. It's like Malcolm and Martin and Yavi and Fiery, Nani.
Everything is falling into place for 13-year-old Kamau. Basketball stardom, a new job, and the adoration of his peers could all be his except for one person that is standing in his way. It's the one person that always stands in his way. His father, Jabari Njama. Instead of letting his son enjoy one last summer before high school, Jabari snatched Kamau from everyone he knows and loves and shipped him off to a strange and abusive summer camp. Once at the camp, Kamau quickly learns that he left the ruthlessness of his father only to be tormented by several other men just like him. All he has to rely on are his own wits and a group of hapless boys that he really doesn't like very much. Together, Kamau and these boys must learn to survive a whole host of challenges from nature, from the tormentors, from each other, and even from themselves. And just when it seems that Kamau has figured out how to survive this strange camp, he and some of his new friends are hurled through space and find themselves in the middle of an alien race and fighting an alien war. To return home, Kamau and his friends will need to use every survival strategy they have learned, and even some that they never knew they had. Will Kamau find the wisdom and strength he needs to return home to his loved ones?
Soundstripe. Soundstripe.
Dear reader, I'm Dr. Jomo W. Mutegi. However, you may call me the professor. This is what Kamau and his friends call me. By profession, I teach at a university and conduct research on how people learn science. I focus specifically on the science learning of African people. This story that I now share with you is unrelated to my professional work. I was asked by Kamau and his friends to share this story. I should admit here that this is not a task to which I am well suited. However, you will come to learn, as I have, that Kamau and his friends are very persuasive. They don't hear no when it does not suit them. How this began. One of my hobbies is camping. I'm nothing like a survivalist, but I enjoy getting out in nature with a backpack and hiking through the woods. In fact, each year I take a special trip where I hike alone for a few days. This is an annual personal retreat that provides me time and space to reflect on my recent past and plan for my near future. What is interesting is that, to my knowledge, no one outside of my wife and sons know that I take this trip. Both the location and the time of the trip change from year to year. Well, one year, not long ago, I was on my retreat alone, or so I thought. It was the evening of the first day. After making camp, I gathered firewood, I sorted it, and stacked it near my fire ring. Then I went to my tent to read and wait for sunset. It was an exceptionally hot summer day, and as I mentioned, I was alone. So for comfort, I came out of my sweaty, soiled outer clothing, wiped myself clean with a moist cloth, and slipped into some fresh skivvies. For the next hour or so, I lay in my tent reading on top of my sleeping bag. Once it became too dark to read by nature's light, I decided to put on fresh evening clothes, make dinner, and enjoy the company of my fire. As I turned and unzipped the doorway of my tent, I looked out to find 5 young men sitting on the ground no more than 7 feet away and looking right back at me. They sat cross legged with their hands on their laps. They formed a half circle and they stared at me intently, saying nothing. As you might imagine, I was scared senseless. How long had they been there? Had they followed me all day? What was their intention? I was convinced that they intended to do me harm. All I could imagine were pictures of my bloodied and beaten corpse all over the newspaper. It might be days or possibly weeks before anyone found me. It could be worse. Suppose they beat me and I lived. I might survive the beating so badly injured that I would need to wait helplessly for relief. How would I get food and water? Wild animals might get my dying flesh. My wife would be a wreck. I refused to be an easy mark for a bunch of kids. My fear gave way to rage. I was determined that mine would not be the only corpse to be found. I reached back into my tent, grabbed my machete, and leapt forward to confront the group. Now, anyone who's tried to get into or out of a tent, and mine is a small two-man tent, anyone knows that it cannot be done gracefully, quickly, or easily, especially while holding a machete. So my leap was probably more of a stumble. At any rate, as I exited the opening of my tent, one of them spoke. Professor, forgive us for sneaking up on you in this way. If you do not mind, we would like to have a private word with you. May I introduce myself? I was completely taken aback. I didn't know what to think. My heart had been beating almost out of my chest. I'm sure I was a sight, standing there dumbly in my skivvies, holding a machete. But at that moment, I didn't consider how foolish I must have looked. I was too relieved. They're not trying to kill me. But as soon as I felt relief, I felt rage again. How do they know me? Thoughts and emotions raced through me. Each hung around just long enough to fill me, then ran off, making room for the next. I must have stood there quietly for minutes, trying to make sense of the situation. Why would they stalk me, of all people? After a few moments, I realized that I was not as decent as I wanted to be. I'd come out of my tent mostly undressed. I then realized that the nature surrounding us was indifferent to my dilemma. Crickets chirped, leaves rustled as chipmunks scurried about, wind whistled through trees. It was nature's way of saying, everything's okay. We'll let you know when there's a real catastrophe. I chuckled, mostly at myself, and finally I answered, sure, you can introduce yourself. But first, let me get dressed. In the meantime, please give me some privacy. We need a fire. I motioned to the fire ring as I went back in my tent to get dressed. By the time I had returned to the group, the fire was roaring. Maybe the shock of the event caused me to misjudge the time. I didn't think I was gone long enough for them to have any fire going at all, let alone a blazing campfire. They were not even tending the fire. They were sitting around it, laughing and telling jokes. I came to the circle, sat with the young men, and introduced myself. Hello, I'm Dr. Jomo W. Mutegi, but I imagine you know that. Now, please, tell me, who are you? Kamau smiled broadly at my introduction, and he introduced himself. Dr. Mutegi, I'm Kamau Njama. He then introduced each of the young men that were with him, complete with given name and nickname. I shook hands with each of the young men in turn. As Kamau concluded, I invited the young men to join me for dinner. They agreed enthusiastically, a little too enthusiastically as it turned out. They ate all the dinner provisions I had from my entire trip. As we began cooking, Kamau looked at one of the young men, then motioned to the tree line. He zipped off. Then another young man began what looked like a second fire about 30 feet off in the distance. He appeared to be stacking thick logs in a square configuration, leaving the middle empty. It looked more like a miniature cabin than the start of a fire. After a few moments, he returned to our fire and, without saying a word, pulled a camp shovel from his backpack, took some red hot coals from our fire, marched off to his new fire, and dumped them into the empty middle of his little cabin. He repeated this 3 times. He then added a row of thick kindling across the top of the square structure he had built. This was unlike any campfire I had ever seen. I looked at Kamau and commented, he'll never get a fire going like that. Kamau smiled and nodded confidently. No worries, Professor. If it doesn't work, he can always start again. The young man then stacked another layer of large logs on top of the kindling, just before disappearing into the wood. While he was gone, the first young man returned with a dead rabbit hanging from his left hand. He said nothing. He sat down and began skinning it just as plainly as if he were washing his utensils. I looked at Kamau in protest. Hey, I have food for us to eat. The young man looked up and replied coolly, yes, sir, this is for later. As it turned out, the second fire was actually a smoker. The young man who had begun the second fire returned with freshly cut evergreen boughs that he used as a cover for the smoker. The freshly killed and skinned rabbit was to be smoked. Over dinner, Kamau and the young men wasted no time. They jumped right in, telling me the most fantastic story that I had ever heard. As they began, Kamau insisted that I take notes on their story. I protested, claiming I had no notebook with which to record notes. Before my protest was complete, one of the young men offered me a composition book with my name neatly written in it. According to the young men, They had traveled to a distant planet, met other life forms, fought against an alien race, and returned to Earth unscathed. Their story was a great campfire tale. I would have enjoyed it had they not been so insistent that it was true. I did not believe a word of it. In fact, the more they talked, the more absurd their story became. In time, I began to doubt even their names. Why would these young men stalk me, of all people, create this elaborate fiction, and try to convince me of it? They were a strange mystery. They were all very polite, much more polite than most young people nowadays. They were far more mature than typical young men their age. Certainly, they had all the awkwardness and some of the silliness that came with adolescence. Their voices cracked and they giggled. Someone would make a reference that really was not funny, and they would giggle. They sometimes teased each other playfully, and of course, they giggled. However, none of them spoke too much. They were very disciplined, so much so that they seemed trained. Although the mood was light, and despite their awkwardness, I felt as though I was in the company of men whose first priority was business. Yes, these young men were a great mystery. And that night I never came to understand this mystery. But after a while, I did not try. I simply resigned myself to enjoying the entertainment and their company for the remainder of that night. We ate, laughed, sang songs, and told tales. In fact, we did this until the next morning. As dawn began to break, Kamau looked at me and said, Professor, we've enjoyed your company. Please write and share our story. It is vital to the well being of our people. I thought to myself, the last thing our people need is another grand deception. I didn't share that thought, it would have been rude. I did, however, protest a third time. You know I'm not an author. Kamau retorted, Actually, sir, you are an author. You are a very good author. I've read several of your papers. You make complex ideas easy to understand. It is also clear from your writing that you love Black people. Kamau, it's not the same. Those are academic papers. They are written for a completely different audience. One of the other young men intervened. Baba, of course, we cannot make you write this story, but you should know that you specifically were chosen to do this small task. It is not for us, it is for our people. You were chosen by people much wiser and more powerful than us. You were chosen by the council. Our job is simply to ask you to do this. If you're uncertain about anything we've shared, please take time to see whether our story is consistent with known facts. The appeal was very reasonable. It was too reasonable for a young man his age. I nodded towards the young man. I will consider it. That is more than fair, the young man responded. Kamau then interjected. Professor, do you have a washcloth or a moist towel that we can use to freshen up? Sure, I said. I headed towards my tent and climbed in to retrieve a small pack of wet wipes. As I returned to share them, the young men were all gone. They had vanished just as quickly as they had come. What was most strange was that they left no trace of having been there. I circled the camp area. Their gear was gone. The fire of the smoker had died out. There was not even so much as a footprint indicating their presence. I walked to the edge of the clearing and peered into the wood. I saw no trace of them. I did not hear footsteps. I did not see any unnatural movement in the wood. I began to question my own sanity. Had I dreamt or imagined the whole thing? It was weird, and I had no answers. As I approached my tent to lie down and gather my thoughts, I saw a bundle of leaves just to the left of my tent door. To my complete surprise, it was smoked rabbit meat, wrapped in sycamore leaves. I laughed loudly. Those are some young men. As I examined the meat and the leaf wrapping, I realized this was for later. Later that day, or after that day, I saw Kamau and his friends many more times. These meetings were never planned by me. However, I have learned to be ready for them. Kamau might show up at any location, at any time, under any circumstance. He's like a living apparition. He might appear to review a draft of this text, to pass a message, or even to provide new information. It has gotten to the point that Kamau's presence is always felt. This story only came about as a result of his persistence. The next time Kamau visited me was 3 months after our introduction in the woods. He appeared at my hotel when I was traveling on business. He simply wanted to ask how the story was coming. I had not written a lick, had not intended to. After the second meeting, however, I began to investigate the viability of his claims. I have learned that none of his claims can be disproven. None of his claims contradict any known facts. The technology that the young men claim to use is either real existing technology or it is viable technology. The method they claim to use for time travel is theoretically validated. The scientist Kamau identified as a pioneer of this work is real. I've spoken with him. In the area of space they claim to have visited, there is a star. In fact, all available evidence suggests that there is an Earth like planet orbiting that star. Even theories about the climate of that planet fit Kamau's description. So, although their story is a fantastic one, and although it sounds far fetched, there is no available evidence that allows me to disprove or even discount it. And given what I know of science, technology, Kamau, and his friends, I'm inclined to believe them. Sincerely, Jomo W. Mutegi, the professor.
Soundstripe. Soundstripe.
Chapter 1, Quick Summer, A Perfect Day. Kamau's Big Opportunity. Kamau ran excitedly to the school gym. It was sixth period study hall on the last day of school, and he and one other boy had been summoned to the gym to meet with the basketball coach from the neighboring high school. This could only mean one thing, Kamau thought. Coach Salters is going to let me try out for the JV team next year. The boys' high school had an incredibly competitive athletic program, and the boys' JV and varsity basketball teams were the school's strongest performing teams. Kamau and his teammates had seen Coach Salters at a few of their middle school games this year. The whole team knew that someone was being scouted, but no one knew who. Now Kamau had some answers. The other young man was Big Javen. Big Javen was a center. He was a 6 foot 9 inch, thickly built eighth grader with very little basketball skill and even less athleticism. But what Kamau and his teammates learned this past year is that a 6 foot 9 inch eighth grader doesn't need basketball skill or athleticism to make an impact. By contrast, Kamau was a wiry 5 foot 4 inch, thinly built eighth grader with average basketball skill and tremendous athleticism. He was the team's point guard. All year, Kamau's middle school coach, Coach Jenkins, was hounding him to bring out the best in Javen. Kamau didn't really know what that meant. When he passed the ball to Javen in the post, Javen would drop it. When he dumped the ball to Javen on a drive, Javen would drop it. When he lobbed a pass to Javen from the perimeter, which he only did once, Javen raised his hands and flapped at it as it went by. With his hands up, Kamau could see Javen's stomach and back jiggling shamelessly underneath his jersey. Yet he never spoke ill of Javen. In fact, they got along very well. Off the court, Kamau befriended Javen. On the court, Kamau used Javen for screens, had him set picks for everyone, and forced opponents into his zone on defense. Javen averaged 12 block shots per game and scared the bejesus out of most of his opponents. Was that bringing out the best in Javen? Probably not. Washington Middle School finished the season with a very mediocre record of 6 wins and 5 losses, and they finished third in the conference tournament. It was no matter. Oh, it was no matter that Kamau finished the year as it was no matter since Kamau finished the year as the leading scorer. No one doubted his game. Javen and Kamau arrived at the gym and approached Coach Salters, who was standing and talking to Coach Jenkins. Kamau reached out to shake hands with Coach Jenkins. Good afternoon, Coach. He made sure to stand straight, project his voice, and look Coach Jenkins in the eye. Kamau's father had conditioned him to make proper greetings. Good afternoon, Kamau. Coach Jenkins smiled at him warmly. Javen nodded towards Coach Jenkins. Hey, Coach. Javen, Coach Jenkins replied. Gentlemen, this is Coach Salters. Coach Salters is the coach of the boys' JV and varsity teams at Du Bois High School. I talk with Coach Salters about your strengths and weaknesses as I see them. Coach Salters also has watched a few of your games. Kamau nodded, smiled at Coach Salters, and continued listening. Javen shuffled his feet slightly, stared at his shoes, and uttered, "Hmm." Coach Jenkins continued. Coach Salters, this is Kamau Njama, our point guard, and Javen Brown, our center. Kamau reached out to shake hands with Coach Salters. Pleased to meet you, sir. Javen followed Kamau's lead and shook hands, simply saying, Coach. Coach Salters addressed the boys. Boys, I will cut right to the chase. You both have a chance of making the JV team next year and possibly making the varsity team by the time you reach 10th grade. But you don't have a good chance. You both have potential, but it's going to take a lot of work for you to realize that potential. You will need to put in the work and grow in some key areas. Coach Salters was a brusque, no nonsense man. He didn't waste words and had little concern for anyone's feelings. Kamau appreciated his straightforward approach. Javen was now looking Coach Salters squarely in the eyes. He was all ears. Coach Salters continued, Javen, you have 2 left hands and 10 thumbs. You need to improve your skill with the basketball. You need to work on catching, passing, and shooting, particularly your shooting in the paint. This summer, I want you to spend 2 hours a day catching, passing, and shooting. Normally, I would not look twice at a kid with your skill level. But you, son, are 6'9". Enough said. Javen stared at Coach Salters, nodding and grinning. Coach Salters then turned to Kamau. Kamau, you are a phenomenal athlete. In fact, you are the strongest athlete I've seen in the past 15 years. Because of that, I'm willing to work with you. However, to improve, you will need to work on your skills with the ball as well, especially your shooting and dribbling. Your shooting percentage from the field is 35%, and from the free throw line, it's 60%. Those numbers are too low. Your goal should be to improve those numbers to 70% and 90% on a practice court. Then we will see what they look like in competition. But your biggest challenge is learning to manage a game and lead a team. To help with managing a game, Coach Jenkins will give you some film to watch and study over the summer. Learning to lead a team is more difficult. Kamau was so excited he could hardly contain himself. You wouldn't think he had just been told what a terrible shooter and team leader he was. Coach Salters handed each of the boys a brochure. There will be a skill building camp at the Stokely Center this summer. It's a 2-week camp. It costs $400 and it's well worth it. If you expect to play for me, you will be there. Coach Salters grabbed his valise and walked towards the door. If you have any questions, reach out to Coach Jenkins. He waved to Coach Jenkins. Thanks again, Chris. I'll see you next Friday. With that, he was gone. Coach Jenkins smiled at Kamau and Javen. Congratulations, gentlemen. Work hard this summer. I look forward to seeing you take your game to the next level. Kamau and Javen couldn't stop high-fiving and backslapping one another. Kamau bounced all the way back to study hall. For the last 20 minutes of class, he sat there, grinning goofily and hiding his face behind a book. He knew he looked ridiculous, but he didn't care. Another win. Just before the bell rang, Kamau's study hall teacher approached and handed him a hall pass. Mr. Evans wants to see you at the end of 6th period. Kamau's heart sank, and his grin was wiped clean. What did I do? He muttered to himself. The teacher smiled, raised her eyebrows, and walked away. Mr. Evans was the dean of students, and no one really wanted to see him, ever. Kamau racked his brain, trying to recall any mischief he'd been involved in over the past few weeks, but he could think of nothing. When the bell rang, Kamau headed towards the main office, hiding the yellow hall pass. The bounce, the light heart, the never-ending grin he had just minutes before were all gone. He walked slowly and solemnly, trying to figure out what he was going to say to his father. The thought of seeing Mr. Evans unnerved him, but the thought of facing his father scared him. Kamau walked into Mr. Evans' office and offered him the hall pass. Ignoring the pass, Mr. Evans looked at Kamau, smiling. Have a seat, Kamau. Kamau took a seat and addressed Mr. Evans. Good afternoon, sir. He was instantly at ease as he thought, a smile? A smile is good news. I didn't know Mr. Evans ever gave good news. Mr. Evans began. Kamau, earlier this year, you took an eighth and ninth grade version of the preliminary scholastic aptitude test, the PSAT 89. The Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT, is a test that students take, which is used in making college admissions and scholarship decisions. Normally, the PSAT 89 is voluntary, but our PTA, that stands for Parent Teacher Association, decided to have every eighth grade student at Washington Middle School take the exam. Kamal's eyes glazed over as his mind drowned in Mr. Evans' alphabet soup. Mr. Evans continued speaking, but Kamal was no longer listening. Mr. Evans paused. Do you follow me so far? Kamal stammered. I think so, sir. So I took a test. Mr. Evans responded eagerly. Yes, you took a test, and you performed very well on the test. Very well. In fact, you scored in the 70th percentile of all students taking the test. Now, my understanding is that you intend to attend Du Bois High School next year. If that is the case, then you should know that DHS students with high academic potential are encouraged to apply for the Gifted and Talented program. Once in the GT program, you will have the opportunity to take AP courses, that stands for Advanced Placement, and dual enrollment courses. With your score on the PSAT 89 and your GPA, you have a very good chance of getting into the GT program. Kamal's lips were moving, and he looked confused. Mr. Evans asked, what part is unclear? Kamal wanted to say all of it, but he felt that might be disrespectful and didn't want any problems. Instead, he said, so you're saying that I took a test and I did well on the test? Mr. Evans smiled. Yes, Kamal, that's right. Kamal couldn't reconcile getting a 70% on a test and having that be a good thing, but he didn't dare ask. That would invite Mr. Evans to give an impromptu math lesson. Instead, he asked, have you told my parents? Mr. Evans knew where this was going. Not yet. I plan to call them this evening between 4 and 4:30. Does that timing work for you? Kamal smiled. That timing is perfect. We eat dinner at 5 o'clock. Kamal thanked Mr. Evans and left quickly before he had a chance to break out into any further elaborate explanations. It was all Kamal could do to keep from running to seventh period. The bounce, the grin, the light heart, they were all back. Kamal thought, today is a perfect day. This is going to be a perfect summer. Section 3, A Long Walk Home. At the end of eighth period, when the final bell rang, the school erupted in a frenzy of shouts and cheers. Students flooded the halls and made liberal use of the garbage cans, eighth graders especially. Kamal's section of the hall was abuzz with chatter. Kevin clapped Kamal on the back and exclaimed loudly, Yo, Kamal, word on the street is that you about to be the Spartan point guard at Du Bois next year. Go get him, my dude. Kamal thought wryly. Well, as usual, word on the streets is wrong. But before he could speak up and add some truth to the discussion, Andre added, man, with Kamal running the point and Big J running the paint, DHS is going to take state. Take state? Are you kidding? Kamal thought. We couldn't even. Kamal's thought was interrupted as Carmen Anderson walked past, smiling flirtatiously at Kamal. Congratulations, point guard. She ran her hand along his chest and shoulder as she walked through to her locker, swinging to and fro like a pendulum. What little cool Kamal had, he lost it. The stupid grin went into overdrive. He felt it stretching the muscles of his face, but he couldn't make it go away. Carmen was one of the finest girls in the school. She was a copper-complexioned beauty that had blossomed into womanhood a bit earlier than the other girls, and everyone knew it. As the chatter continued, Kamal gave up hope of adding truth to the discussion and got lost in his own thoughts of local high school stardom. He imagined an entire school year of boys congratulating and high-fiving him, and girls giggling at him, starry-eyed whenever he'd give them attention. His daydream was interrupted by a deep voice. Yo, big man, you ready? Kamal turned quickly to see Imani holding a few books and smiling at him. She giggled and said deeply, You like my man voice? Kamal smiled. Let's go, sis. Imani Baharia was Kamal's best friend, and they had literally grown up together. Their parents were close friends. They were born 2 weeks apart, and since that time, they shared cribs, playpens, toys, and books. They learned to walk and talk at about the same time, and they had too many playdates to count. As they got older, they had both gotten into nasty fights protecting each other. Many of the kids at school thought that Imani was Kamal's twin sister. As they headed home, Imani commented, So, you had a big day. I heard, well, everyone has heard that Coach Salters invited you to play at Du Bois next year. Well, Coach Salters invited us to try out for the team, but he emphasized that right now we're not good enough to be on the team. He wants us to work on improving our basketball skills this summer. She asked, how do you feel about that? I feel great about it. He gave me an opportunity, and I'm going to take it. I'm going to work hard this summer, practicing and training. I've already made my daily schedule. The way I look at it, this summer I will be on a 24/7 grind. Physical conditioning, strict diet, film study, skill development. Kamal's voice rose with excitement. Then next year, when I try out, I'm definitely going to make the JV basketball team. There ain't no doubt about that. But my real goal, Kamal lowered his voice, this between me and you, is to earn a starting position. This summer is about to be perfect. Everything is almost lined up. Lined up for what? Imani asked curiously. Lined up for a good year. If I make the team, especially if I start, I'm going to be the man. But I also need some new gear. I need some new kicks. I need a little bling. Kamal held his thumb and finger close together and squinted when he said little. So I'm working on getting a landscaping job at Gary's Garden Center. Kamal smiled. I told you, 24/7 grind. Imani smiled at Kamal with admiration. Kamal, I'm really proud for you. Thanks, sis. After a moment of quiet reflection, Imani's smile faded, and she asked hesitantly, what about your dad? Does he know about the plan? Section 4. Kamal faces reality. Kamal clicked his teeth and exhaled forcefully, rolling his eyes. Not yet, but I plan to tell him tonight. The enthusiasm was gone from Kamal's voice, and suddenly his confidence was shaken. Kamal's father was a very strict and unreasonable man. Kamal asked Imani, he had to agree, right? What father doesn't want his son to work? Imani raised her eyebrows, tilted her head, and softly mouthed, yeah. But nothing came out. She knew Baba Njama. He was very much like her own father. They were both strong willed black men, filled with paranoid delusions about how the world worked. They saw conspiracies around every corner. Hollywood was out to get us. Homosexuals were out to get us. The fast food industry was out to get us. Corporations, schools, book publishers, black churches, white churches, the police, FBI, CIA, politicians. There was no end to the list of organizations that were lined up to destroy black people. Their father's paranoia severely restricted Kamal's and Imani's lives. But Imani also believed that such fathers, were harder on their sons than on their daughters. After a long silence, Imani thought again about Kamal's question, and she talked straight. Kamal, what father doesn't want his son to work? If any father wouldn't want his son to work, it would be your father. It would be my father if he had a son, and we wouldn't even know the reason why. Kamal shook his head. Yeah, you got that right. Even if they told us, we wouldn't understand. He deepened his voice and began mocking his father. You see, son, the Illuminati came together in the Middle Ages and invented jobs to deprive the peasants of their freedom. They both laughed. Then Imani, using her man voice, added, then when official slavery ended, they introduced job peasantry slavery and gave it to the black man. Now, you don't want to be a slave, do you? When their laughter subsided, Imani stopped walking and grabbed Kamal's arm. Kamal, you don't need a plan to get past Coach Salters. You need a plan to get past your father. What are you going to do? Kamal sighed heavily. I don't know, sis. I did get a high score on some tests we took, and Mr. Evans said it would help me when I went to Du Bois next year. He's supposed to call my parents tonight, so that's good news, and it might help. They continued walking, and Imani asked, why is basketball, new kicks, and a little bling so important to you? You're already a good athlete. You're a strong student. You dress fine. Everybody likes you. Kamal gave Imani a sideways, disbelieving look. Really? You think everybody likes me? I'm a slightly above average basketball player, a slightly above average student, with average clothes and a few friends. If I weren't here tomorrow, no one would care. Imani punched Kamal's arm angrily. Why would you say that? I would care. Your mother would care. Your sister would care. And your mean father? Even if he would care. Still angry, she muttered, I can't believe you would say something like that. Kamau clicked his teeth again and looked down sheepishly. Yeah, I suppose. But that's family. His voice dropped. I just don't feel important to anyone. Imani nodded in understanding. She knew that Kamau was bearing his soul, and she also knew he should handle it with care. They walked for a few minutes in silence. When she broke the silence, she asked, what was that show Carmen was putting on for you in the hallway? Imani mocked Carmen with a sultry voice. Let me rub you with my musty mitts, point guard. Kamau nodded and laughed. Yeah, she was doing too much, wasn't she? That's not my style. Imani nodded. No doubt. You better wash that shirt. You know she got cooties. Kamau walked Imani to her door, then headed home. They lived in the same small community. There were about 3 square blocks where all the families knew each other. Kamau once overheard his father explaining to someone that the Njamas and a group of 4 other families moved into this neighborhood when it was run down and overrun with drug activity. Each of those 5 families fixed up their respective houses, and together they chased the drug dealers out of the neighborhood. Over time, they pooled their money, and whenever a new house became available, they bought it, chose a family, and invited them to move in. Kamau did not know the exact number of families in the neighborhood. He had never counted, but he knew he was safe in this 3 square block area. It was an oasis of well maintained homes, beautifully manicured lawns, and clean streets. The neighbors all looked out for one another. Neighborhood toughs knew it was a safe place. Excuse me, neighborhood toughs knew it was not a safe place to ply their trade, so they did business elsewhere. The closer Kamau got to home, the more his heart raced. As he approached the door, he realized that he was lightheaded. How would his father respond? Kamau felt sick with worry as he keyed the lock and walked in. Okay, family, I'm going to stop the share at that point. That was chapter 1. And let me see, there are no questions. I'm going to give it a minute. In education, we call this wait time. And I'm going to wait for a minute or so that if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat. And I say chat, it's not chat, it's just the Q&A. If I weren't so shame, I might sing to you while I'm waiting on the questions, but I don't want to chase nobody off, so I'll keep my singing to myself. Okay, let's see a raised hand, but now don't raise your hand. Just put your question in the Q&A. I can't respond to a raised hand with the platform. All right, so our first question, did your work with students inspire your topic? If so, how? So what I tell everyone about this is that the the story is really my retelling of the story that was told to me by Kamau and his friends. But with any retelling, we can retell a story in a number of ways. Um, if someone doesn't like you, they can tell a story about you to make you look like the devil himself. You've been living 30 years, for example. They can pick the 30 years of your life, of those 30 years of life, they can pick your worst moments, and that's all they'll share. And so you look like a terrible person. By the same token, someone could take those 30 years of life and pick all of your best moments, and then you become a very different person. So, although the story is my retelling of a story that was told to me, what I did do was in retelling the story, I looked for those elements that I thought would resonate with readers. And so some of the bigger themes are themes like the relationship between Kamau and his father. I could have told the story without talking about that, but it was really central. And to me, it's something that other young men could identify with. The relationship he has with Imani, I thought was very important to foreground in the story. As we get later on in the book, you'll see I won't say Kamau has difficulty building uh, relationships, but his personality is one where he's very indifferent to other people, um, and very selfish, which is to some degree a trait of adolescence. It I think though Kamau has an extra dose of that trait. And so some of what he learned through the events that transpired in this first in this story that was told to me, really was him coming to grips with his selfishness and learning to foreground other people and the needs of other people. And that's one thing that really comes out in the story as it unfolds. So I would say the short answer is yes. My work with students inspired the story, um, but I think it was just because my work with students and not just students, but other people. Um, and the person who asked me this, uh, uh, Sarge, really my work with you, right? So you've given me a lot of insight that has shaped how I look at the world, and then it really in turn shaped how I looked at Kamau and the story that he told me. So the short answer is yes. Okay, so someone is asking, is the story true? To the best of my knowledge, I again the piece I wrote in the beginning is the best way I have to deal with the story and the truth or falseness of the story. Look, I mean, I'm an academic, and I'm conditioned to not make statements that I can't stand behind. And so, if you have just a regular conversation with me, you'll hear me qualifying in most instances. This is what I believe, and this is what it seems to me, and that's just become a habit, a way of thinking. And so, when I say that I cannot disprove any of the claims, that's the best I can give you. Am I going to stand out and say it's true and argue? No, I'm not going to do that because it doesn't sound true to me. But I tried to disprove it, and I haven't been able to. So that's the best I can give you. Okay. I'm clicking these off as I answer them, and if you have follow up, feel free to follow up. I'm just going to go through the list. Okay. Then another question: what made you transition from children's stories to novels? Okay, that's a good question. So I wouldn't say I've transitioned. So I still do write children's stories, and I think by children's stories you're referring to shorter stories, picture books, leveled readers. Um, but one of the things that excited me about the idea of writing a longer piece is that I've been writing children's books since 2014, and so a lot of the young people, families who bought those early books, they're aged out of those books now. I mean, that was what, almost 10 years ago, 9 years ago now. So if they were 3 or 4 years old when their parents bought those early readers, they'd be what, 12, 13 years old now. And so I thought it would be nice to have a book that would be meaningful to them in their older years. And so with Kamau's pestering and my own reflection, I thought, okay, maybe this wouldn't be bad. It could be something that would be of service to some of the people, the young people who um, who have been readers for me up to this point. So, but that being said, I still do write children's books, the picture books. So the most recent one was out last year, Daffy Dog Diva, or this past January actually, January 2023. That one came out, and then I have another one with a colleague who is a climatologist on hurricanes, and he and I are working to get that one produced. Which so we hope that it will be out sometime in 2024. Okay. Um, do you plan to make your book an audiobook? You know what? I would love to make this book an audiobook. And in fact, I almost think it's necessary because the number of people that actually sit down with a physical book and read is low. Not many people sit and read anymore. Um, and I've had estimates done, so it's costly. And I was hoping that this Kickstarter might overproduce, and then we'd have enough to put some of that into an audiobook production. But unless something special happens in the next week, we won't hit numbers that we need for audiobook. But it still is on my radar, and I may come back to the family later and see if there's enough interest to generate some contributions to help cover the cost of audiobook production. But for sure, the answer is yes. I do want to produce it as an audiobook. Okay, I noticed that most of the names in the book are African names. Is that intentional in design? It seems like you included a lot of African elements. How do you expect it to impact readers? That's an excellent question. I appreciate that. So, um, we will get to this part. Very likely, we'll get to part book two. And in fact, after today's reading, we did the whole chapter in like 40 minutes. We'll probably get through maybe like six chapters. We'll probably get close to six chapters. So we'll be well into book two by the end of the week. Um, Now, when we get to that chapter, you'll see a lot more African names. And really, what I've learned is that this community that Kamau comes from, it's mixed. So there's a segment of the community that is African centered, and they're culturally embracing African practices. So the names, the celebrations, they're all there. But then there's another segment of the community that is, I'll just, for lack of a better word right now, say more African American, but with a degree of consciousness about themselves. So they haven't embraced African culture to the same degree. So there you'll have more Americanized, anglicized names, though they still are intimately involved in this community that Kamau comes from. And thus far in the story, we haven't talked much about this community, but there was just an allusion to it near the end of this first chapter when we talk about the neighborhood. So the neighborhood that he's in is just one neighborhood throughout the country of a group of loosely affiliated communities of African centered people that are working together again with loose affiliation, but in a concerted way towards bettering the condition of Black people. And so that's where we'll see the more use of African names in terms of people's names. And then when we get to the Vanguard Order, they are fully African, Pan Africanist ideologically. So not only are their names African, but they speak different African languages. The most dominant languages they speak are Swahili and Zulu, Yoruba, and then also the names of their artifacts, their buildings, their structures, key events, all African, and not from any one African culture. It's an amalgamation. I think they haven't said this to me explicitly. It's just my sense is that it seems that they're doing it intentionally to honor the breadth of the African diaspora. I shouldn't say diaspora. The breadth of our Africanness throughout the continent. So um, if I didn't answer that question clearly, Julius, then hit me back with a follow up. Okay. Okay. So next one. How difficult was it to transition from my empirical work, nonfiction work, to fiction? That's a good question. And in what ways did your research methods shift to accommodate this book? Okay, I love that question. So, and a friend of mine asked, one of my beta readers asked about how I learned to write fiction. And so basically, if you've ever read my academic writing, you will notice elements of fiction in it. And it's just because I try to make it interesting to the reader. So I do use a lot of vignettes and I adopt a storytelling um, posture in my writing. Now that is not the same as writing a novel or storytelling, but what it does mean is that the adjust for me mentally was not difficult. Me knowing, okay, I want to I want to hook the reader and keep them hooked. So what do I need to do that? In academia, we're not interested in hooking the reader and keeping them hooked. We just, putting the facts out there on the page in a way that's organized by our standard. Um, and so with me coming to it, realizing that I have to engage the reader, hook the reader, keep them engaged and hooked, I began then looking at models. And I first, I mimicked pretty well. So I asked myself, what are some of my favorite stories to read? And I pull those as exemplars. And I have three books, two books, and then one author with all his books kind of fit that I will read them three, four, five, six, seven times. There's one book I read every year. Um, and so I use those as models, and I just started asking myself, okay, what do they do in this book that makes me like it so much? What is the tone in this book? Why does this part of the book resonate with me? Why does this part kind of make me want to skip past it? And so that was my first pass. Then my second pass was I put a few texts which give you, they really tell you how do you write a novel, how do you construct a story, um, and so I use that as another kind of self teaching method. And then there's a few authors who do podcasts, and they just share with their listeners different elements of storytelling. So I might listen to a podcast on setting a scene. Okay, so I listen to the podcast and I go away from the podcast and say, okay, let me do some practice on this and see if I can set a scene. Then I'll come back to the podcast, listen again, and then try it again with another scene setting. And that kind of self practice is what I've used to help. And quite honestly, I feel that this is my first debut. It's my first novel, my debut novel. I think it's good, and I'm saying that based on the response I've gotten from beta readers. But I think it can be better. And so my son and I have been listening to the Harry Potter series, and there's elements now of that series that I'm listening to, which it does things that I had not considered prior to writing this story. Um, but I see that there's a lot of room there still for me to grow in my writing. So when book two comes out, I expect it to be even a better product than book one. But that doesn't mean that book one's not good. Book one is still very good. It's a very engaging read. Okay. Can you share the link for your Kickstarter? Yes, I can. Let me see. It's my screen. Okay, the screen share I think is off. Uh, okay, be patient with me. How do I make this go away? Show taskbar. Oh, wait a minute. It's down here. Okay. Okay, and what I'll do is I think I can put this in the chat. Oh, I don't know if I can put this in the chat. Oh, I can type my answer. All right, so here, if you in the Q&A, okay, give me a thumbs up if you see that answer. Oh, answered. There it is. Okay, I see it. So on my screen, it's under the tab answered. So at the very top of the Q&A box, it says open, answered, and dismissed. And if you go to answered, it'll be there. All right. Next question. What impact do you think a novel will have on African American children committing committed to liberating and uplifting African people all over the world? You know, that's a good question. I don't have a definitive answer. But what I will say is this. I do know that media impacts us. Books, television, stories, they do have an impact on how we think and how we live our lives. I remember as a kid, one of the books me and a buddy of mine read, we were in fifth grade, and the book it was a series, The Great Brain. And The Great Brain was a Mormon kid, and he was like a con man, and he would do little, I don't know, 9, 10-year-old con man activities. And me and my friend run around trying to be little con man. And we didn't stop till we were about in seventh grade, just behind the great brain. And so, does it have an impact? For sure. For sure it does. So my hope is that what this story does is it gives our children a broader range of possibilities for living life as Black men in particular, because it centers around a boy and his experiences. Um, but the but just being Black people in general. And so some of the themes I think are themes that are very important for our sons and our daughters to develop, but we don't find it in the media that's provided to us. Um, I'll share one of the themes that stands out is just the theme of working through your difficulties. So Kamau, we see right now, Kamau has a challenge. What is he going to do with his father and with his summer? And how is he going to figure that out? That's really the bulk of the first book one and the first half of book two. It's him coming to grips with the fact that, okay, this is my problem and it's my responsibility to fix this problem. One of the men who is working with him in book two is having a conversation, and Kamal asks me, says, "Well, look, tell me what to do." And the man says, "No, I'm not going to tell you what to do. That's your job. You have to figure out what to do. That's part of being a man. This is your problem, and it doesn't even have to be a problem, but it is, and that's okay. But because you have made this your problem, then you have to figure out a solution. Now I'll support you in it. I'll be a sounding board for you, but I'm not going to do it for you." And I think that's an important theme for our young people to face. I teach college students. I can't tell you how many times, guaranteed every semester, I have 2 or 3 students come to me and put their problem on my plate. Like, well, I know we have class money, but I got this other thing to do. And then they start looking at me like, okay, you want me to fix that for you? It's not my job. And so there's many other things, but that's one example of one thing. But so in that sense, I think that it definitely will give our young people a broader range of things to think about, and a broader range of possible solutions to problems and challenges. Um, Baba Baruti, who is in Atlanta, he actually was one of the beta readers, and he wrote a review for it, which I will be releasing that pretty soon. But one of the things he said, which I hadn't thought about, was that the book is teaching in a way that you don't even expect it's teaching. And I didn't write it to be teaching in that moment necessarily. But he pointed out that a lot of the vocabulary and the ideas are informative. And I've had conversations with other beta readers about specific elements of the text that cause both them and me to go back and confirm, okay, is this historically accurate? And so Kamal's story is very rich in a lot of science, a lot of history, a lot of sociology. And so I think it has potential to excite young people in a wide variety of areas. Okay, another question. Would you consider this novel in the Afro? Yes. So let me read the question. Would you consider this novel in the Afrofuturistic genre? And the answer is yes. And that's how I've market it or talk about it. I characterize it as an Afrofuturist novel. It's not quite science fiction because it doesn't fit the parameters of science fiction. It's not in a future world that's devoid of plant life, which is one way that you generally characterize science fiction. Um, it's not fantasy. There's no magic and mysticism. One friend asked me today, said, "Is there any demonic elements?" Like, no, it's no demons, no ghosts and goblins in it. So it doesn't fit fantasy. And I think Afrofuturist is the closest genre to what this book represents. I really wish that we had a name for the genre. Um, we have a group of people who make music, Brothers Keeper, United Front, and they refer to their music as African insurrection music. In a sense, I see this as an African insurrection story. It's really a story primarily about Black liberation. It's about a group of people who are working to liberate our people. And I think that's be the easiest fit for it, but that doesn't exist as a genre. If Barnes and Noble picked it up, they don't have that label on the shelf to put the book. So the closest that I could find was Afrofuturism. Okay, and thank you. So I really appreciate everyone for your time, for your questions, and I want to encourage you to visit the Kickstarter. I put the link in the chat, but I'll just say if you go to Kickstarter, do a search for Secrets of the Vanguard Order, it will come up. You could do a search for Secrets of the Vanguard Order. You could do a search for my name. It should come up in case you weren't able to see the Q&A in the chat. And we'll be back here tomorrow night at 7, and we'll pick up with chapter 2. All right. Thank you all.